How big is the threat of further Islamo-fascist terrorism in America? Well, there's no one more qualified to answer that question than our speaker this evening. Steve Emerson got both bachelor's and master's degrees from Brown University, and Steve, we won't hold that against you. Came to Washington and worked for the Senate Armed Services Committee, then turned to journalism, where he gained recognition as a leading authority on terrorism, and then produced the renowned landmark PBS documentary, Terrorists Among Us, Jihad in America. During that program, Steve stood in front of the World Trade Center in the aftermath of the 1993 Twin Towers bombing and eerily predicted exactly what wound up happening on 9/11. Steve went on to found the Investigative Project on Terrorism, and he's been called many things, good and bad, but among them, the New York Post has called him the nation's foremost journalistic expert on terrorism.
Our biggest problem is the political correctness that is constricting and handcuffing law enforcement, but also the political correctness that seeks to appease the Islamists in this country who have established an incredibly sophisticated and comprehensive network of front groups and alliances with collaborators such as the New York Times or the Washington Post or Hollywood or other elite media or in academia. In the end, the result has been, and that's why I did this film called Jihad in America, The Grand Deception. It's about the threat posed to the United States from the deception that has been achieved by these radical Islamic groups who pretend not to be radical, pretend to be civil rights groups, but that would be equivalent to saying that the SDS or David Duke were civil rights leaders. But they figured out that if they call themselves victims and they claim that there's bias, that's the way to legitimacy. And they've successfully been able to insinuate themselves into positions in the media, into positions in the government, in the White House, in the National Security Council, at the FBI, at the Department of Justice, where you probably have not heard about what has gone on there, and you will hear about it shortly, because we're doing a series of exposés. But this Attorney General, among the many things he's done or hasn't done, has quashed several major indictments of Islamic terrorist financiers. Cases that prosecutors worked on, one case worked on for 10 whole years, concerning the Herndon Charities. Some of you may have heard about it. A labyrinth of front groups that operate out of Northern Virginia, but also had offices around the world funded by Saudis and others from the Middle East, and was subject to FBI raids and government raids in 2002 on the basis of allegations from the intelligence community that they funded terrorism. Well, the government agencies that worked on the case had a very hard time actually unraveling the finances. They were put together in a very sophisticated way. And money laundering cases are very difficult in general to put together. But they did finally produce a 110-count indictment against these individuals. And on the basis of what was the strategy that would put Al Capone in jail. Al Capone was put in jail for income tax evasion, not for being a member of the mob. And the same thing with these individuals who were running these groups, which funded the Islamic Jihad in Florida, who was run by a Professor Al-Arian, who claimed he was running a civil rights group, but was actually running from 1988 till 2000, the North American branch of the Islamic Jihad out of the University of South Florida in Tampa. It was only after 9/11 that the government decided to prosecute. Finally, he got convicted. But this is a parallel for so many other groups that operated freely in the United States as front groups. Many of them got shut down, or some of them got shut down after 9/11, but what we have seen since 9/11 is a reincarnation of many of these groups as, quote, civil rights groups, religious groups, and their entire origins are directly linked to the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, which we know about because of a serendipitous arrest that was made on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in 2005 by state police, who stopped the car that had actually parked itself in the middle of the bridge on the right shoulder, which is illegal, and a woman got out and started videotaping the spans of the bridge. Well, the officer checked the databases and found that the owner of the car was someone that the FBI was very much interested in, a man named Ismail al-Barassi, who lived in Maryland. Well, I remember getting the phone call within 24 hours from prosecutors saying, "What do you have on Barassi?" And without going into greater detail, our organization had a lot of material, so much material that in the next 24 hours, a search warrant was produced based on an affidavit that I ghost wrote for the prosecutor, and they raided his home and discovered the largest treasure trove of national security documents regarding the Muslim Brotherhood, regarding the threat to the United States since the Pumpkin Papers in Algiers.
Wow.
Hundreds of thousands of, now this is an amazing story because literally the FBI, which has pretty good intelligence, had totally been blindsided to the emergence and creation of the sophisticated Muslim Brotherhood infrastructure in the United States. And these documents, it turned out Mr. Barassi was the archivist for the Muslim Brotherhood in the U.S. And he kept detailed records of every single state, of every single agenda, of every single platform, and of their intention to create what was called the civilizational jihadist process. It's a quote, to destroy America from within, okay, to infiltrate from within, okay, and that's essentially, they didn't talk about terrorism, that is violence. They talked about jihad of infiltration, the jihad of taking over peacefully. And this is the conundrum that we face in this country today. Because these groups are not pulling the trigger, because these groups are claiming they're against terrorism, but you'll never hear them say they're against Hamas or Hezbollah. They'll never say that because that's their origins. And because of this Faustian alliance between the left and these Islamic groups, you have a situation where most Americans are oblivious, have not been able to discover all these groups that are front groups for radical Islamic organizations. They'll never call themselves the Muslim Brotherhood. But just remember, the Muslim Brotherhood is a totalitarian group, believes in the imposition of the Sharia. It is a misogynist group that believes in the suppression of women, the execution of apostates. The fact that in Egypt, you had a mass rebellion against a Muslim Brotherhood regime whose motto unofficially was one man, one vote, one time. Even though Mr. Obama and others keep calling this democratically elected government that, and if people had a dispute, they could unelect them, which obviously was not true. The fact that they overthrew this regime was one of the most phenomenal developments, I think, in quote, the Arab Spring, the real Arab Spring. In fact, there's more pluralism in Egypt by the opposition of secularists, of Democrats, of liberals, of women, than there is in the United States. And we ended up on the wrong side of history, we being our government. And so we ended up insisting that Mr. Morsi be released from prison, Muslim Brotherhood be included in electoral politics. Remember, Adolf Hitler got elected through democratic means. And we made the mistake of equating democracy with civil society. Fundamental mistake. Because what Morsi was doing was slowly eradicating any vestiges of a secular regime, and appointing only Islamists. Remember, his last appointment was the governor of the area down in south, who was a former leader of the Islamic Jihad, Jamaat Islamiyah, that killed 77 tourists in 1997. In any case, I'm going to wrap things up sort of quickly here. The deception, and you'll all get a film here, but you're going to have to stay, because you only get it if you stay, deals with the whole issue, and as said by a very eloquent prosecutor, Nathan Garrett, who was one of the leading prosecutors against Hamas. He says, we're not talking about a man holding the gun. We're talking about the community that encourages the man holding the gun. The same community that has been welcomed into the White House hundreds of times, that believe that there is a, quote, war against Islam by the Jews and by Christians, that there's no such thing as Islamic terrorism, that it's only Islamophobia by Stephen Emerson and Tim, welcome to the club, and others here. By the way, the term Islamophobia was invented specifically to discredit and smear any critic of radical Islam. And I make a distinction between radical Islam, and I know it's a hard line, hard line in the sand, sometimes a draw, but there is a distinction. But it was designed to create a situation where anybody like myself, or Dan Pipes, or Robert Spencer, or others, would be deemed racists. And the fact is, it's a projection, because the real racists are those members of these radical Islamist groups that believe the world should be subjugated to Islam, that you all were actually born Muslims. I don't know if you know that. I hate to bring it up tonight. One doesn't convert to Islam, one reverts to Islam. Remember the term Allahu Akbar, which John McCain on Fox infamously said last week, means thank God. Mr. McCain, I think, is losing some of his marbles, because Allahu Akbar means Allah is greatest, not greater, greatest. It's supremacist in orientation, okay? And that the prophets, Christ and Moses, they're all Muslims. And in fact, Islam has to reign supreme. And that's the functional agenda of the Islamist organizations, even though they won't tell you that. They'll come up here and say, we're just like you. Right? But what you have in Hollywood, for example, are gay and lesbian performers who appear at fundraisers for Islamist groups, whose statements on their own website says that gays and lesbians should be killed. That's the Faustian Alliance. And unfortunately, we have a media that is basically not just complacent, but in collusion and cahoots. And we have sources within I have more sources actually within the Islamic groups, I can say this, than the FBI does. One of the reasons is because the FBI, when they have a source and they want to make a case, they force the source to testify, which then ruins their lives. It's important for cases because you need someone to turn state's evidence. But for a Muslim in an organization to testify against his own comrades, he either goes in the witness protection program, he leaves the country, or goes out on his own. And they don't want to do that. I don't blame them. Some will. So we recruit sources that don't have to perform that act of sacrifice. And they give us intelligence. And we see the ties between members of Congress, dozens of members of Congress, the media, Hollywood, internal emails, the White House, and radical Islamic groups, with people, members of political leaders and members of the media that you all know. And none of this has become public, in part because we haven't made it public for fear that I would end up shutting down certain sources of information. And my number one promise to my sources is I will never endanger them. My second promise is to myself, which is I don't want to endanger the flow of information. But in counterintelligence, you always have that dilemma about how much you disclose. I can only tell you that what we have is so much more than has been made public. The Washington Post is delighting the world by exposing every national security secret that has been obtained, stolen by Snowden, and destroying 10 years of work, destroying billions of dollars worth of effective national security cryptology. They will never do a story, and never did a story on the radical jihad network in the U.S. I'll leave this. in the New York Times, after the Iraq War was underway, there was a mea culpa by the New York Times saying, "We're sorry that we ended up covering the war and covering the issue of intelligence that said there was chemical and biological weapons because we were wrong," and did a whole mea culpa, and then tried to prove how viciously perjurious the Bush administration was. But they've never done a story after 9/11 saying, "How did we miss this?" Never. And in fact, the policy of the New York Times now is to take radical Muslim leaders and transform them into moderates. One woman reporter 3 years ago wrote 3 front-page stories on a certain imam in Brooklyn, portraying him as the most moderate imam in the United States. We then went to the imam's website and collected his khutbahs or speeches to the mosque, bought them, translated them from Arabic. In 19 of 20, he called for the killing of Jews and Christians. All of this was left out of the story. The woman won a Pulitzer for the story. Okay, and this goes on all the time. I mean, one of our agendas is to try to correct as much as we can, but we can't. I mean, there's too much. And just the other day, we discovered the chairman of a major House committee, who you all know, had his picture taken with a Hamas front group, and basically bestowed upon them in his annotation saying, "You're the most moderate group in the world," when in fact they're unindicted co-conspirators in the Hamas case. Again, no one knows about this. So you have a conspiracy of silence or collusion, a constellation of mutual interests or whatever, that creates what I call the grand deception. And the film, I think, which by the way, amazingly so, won 5 Best Documentary Awards, including the most recent, the New York City, the Best Documentary in the New York City Film Festival. And I think the reason why it won, even though it's so un-PC, is because of the people that we interview in the film, and including one former member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who for the first time on camera comes out in the film and renounces it and exposes what goes on inside. You can't argue with that. Video is everything. So you'll see the film, you'll get the book. You didn't get the other book, which is like 700 pages and 15,000 footnotes. And I liken it to taking 10 Ambien or stopping bullets. But in any case, thank you for the opportunity to speak.